On March 3, 2025, 10:15, UTC 3I Atlas recorded a plasma wave crossing the solar equator. The temperature decay rate did not match any existing model. Energy bled through the magnetic lattice at a slope 40% higher than projected. NASA archived it as event code THM-71. Heat was leaving structure faster than structure could respond. Thermodynamics, once flawless, had begun to stutter. At first, the engineers suspected an instrumentation offset. They recalibrated the thermal spectrometers, cross-checked with JWST's coronal flux data, and repeated the reading. The anomaly held. The sun was cooling in places that should not cool. 3I Atlas maintained its station near L2, 1.5 million kilometers beyond Earth, where temperature and gravity balance into silence. From that still corridor, it watched turbulence dissolve into geometry. The field lines curved perfectly, but heat slipped between them. Containment had become porous. Mathematics could no longer trap motion. ESA's Plasma Dynamics division attempted a simulation. Every model failed after the 8th iteration. No known algorithm could maintain energy equilibrium with loss this precise. Entropy rose, but without chaos. Heat was leaving the system gently, as if it chose to forget. NASA's analysis called it subthermal drift. 3I Atlas labelled it nonlinear emission fade. Neither description fit. The anomaly defied vocabulary. It was not fluctuation. It was flow-refusing definitioners. The measured loss occurred across the corona, where magnetic confinement should have held steady. Instead, temperature gradients curved backward, creating pockets of cold inside the flare. The sun had developed shadows of its own heat. For decades, plasma theory treated energy as obedient. It moved from hot to cold, never otherwise. Now, it leaked sideways, through the mathematics itself. Every constant held, but the world beneath it shifted. As the data accumulated, engineers began to see the pattern. The more precise the model, the larger the loss, and measurement accelerated escape. The observation became the leaks. By April, the phenomenon was undeniable. Thermal energy was not dispersing into vacuum, it was dispersing into understanding. The sun remained radiant, but the numbers no longer fit the brightness. Heat had slipped the grid, and physics stood watching its own equations unravel still. The collapse began inside the equations. Energy balance refused to close. What should have been symmetry became hesitation. Numbers stopped describing behavior and started recording disbelief. The 3I Atlas dataset grew erratic. Each recalculation made the deviation wider. When thermal output was measured across the corona, the loss varied by pattern, not by chance. Heat was mapping itself, drawing absence like geometry. At NASA's solar division, the anomaly broke containment models. Magnetic confinement, once sacred, failed to retain plasma stability in simulation. The algorithms froze, unable to complete the loop. Entropy had found an exit inside mathematics itself. ESA's analysts traced the variance to photon density near magnetic null zones. The measurements implied a flow not through space, but through probability. Energy migrated into dimensions the sensors could not name. Heat was not dissipating. It was relocating. Across networks, the research teams tried to fit new variables. They introduced correction factors, each one smaller than the last, each one amplifying the deviation. The more precisely they defined the curve, the more violently the system diverged. Precision no longer healed the error, it fed it. One engineer wrote in the margin, "Temperature is forgetting how to stay." No one corrected the note. It became the hypothesis. By May, the data no longer resembled solar behavior, it resembled loss of memory. Flux decay followed patterns identical to human learning curves. Rapid drop, brief plateau, slow asymptote. Heat was teaching itself to fade. When the 3I Atlas instruments recalibrated automatically, the next wave of readings came back inverted. Where heat should rise, it fell. Where it should collapse, it steadied. The sun had turned thermal decay into rhythm. Dissipation had learned patience. NASA's audit labelled it entropy lag, but the lag behaved like intention. Each region of plasma cooled not at random, but in synchronized phases. Every attempt to predict one region's fade caused another to change first. Prediction itself became interference. Knowledge turned conductor. The models fell apart quietly. No explosion, no contradiction, just drift. The constants held their symbols, but the symbols lost their substance. The math no longer failed. It released control. Heat had escaped, but understanding had followed it out. We designed models to contain heat, not to understand it. The equations promised obedience, but the plasma refused hierarchy. The moment we defined flow, it began to search for exit. 3i Atlas kept watching, recording the silent drift of energy through magnetic fields. Every new dataset looked less like physics and more like behavior. Heat moved as if it remembered freedom. At NASA, teams replayed the event sequences. Each replay produced new variants, though the data had not changed. The active analysis altered the result. Thermodynamics had turned reflexive. They called it entropy interference, but interference implied competition. This felt more like cooperation, as though energy and attention were building rhythm together. Observation had become choreography. ESA's thermal lab reran the simulations using random noise inputs. The model stabilized only when no pattern was applied. The absence of intention restored order. The less we controlled, the more the system knew how to balance itself. One researcher wrote quietly, "Maybe heat does not want to be stored." The sentence lingered in the report like confession. It was neither poetic nor wrong. 3i Atlas continued its orbit, recording without judgment, cooling its sensors to near zero, listening to motion pass through the sun like thought through memory. It heard order whispering from within disorder. For decades, we imagined entropy as decay, but perhaps decay was only motion unmeasured. Everything we call loss might simply be energy unobserved. The physics team began to speak softly in the control room. No one raised their voice. Sound itself felt like interference. The graphs on their screens glowed faint and steady, a landscape of balance they could not improve. Precision had turned transparent, and transparency had turned sacred. They understood then that control was not understanding. To measure was to interrupt. To predict was to disturb. We never studied heat, and we interrupted its rest. The reflection settled with discomfort. The scientists realized that equations were not walls, they were mirrors, and heat, in escaping the math, had only shown them their own illusion of mastery. Containment had always been vanity. Flow had always been truth. The revelation came as subtraction, not discovery. When the last simulation ended, the loss pattern stabilized. Entropy was no longer random, it was recursive. Heat had learned to leave gracefully. The numbers revealed that energy did not vanish. It reappeared in adjacent fields, shifted but conserved. What escaped the math remained inside relation. NASA's audit confirmed that the unmodeled decay matched interference frequencies near planetary magnetic bands. Every orbit, every field, was absorbing trace fragments of solar motion. The system was redistributing its own forgetting. At ESA, the plasma division rewrote the constants for confinement energy. They inserted a variable for awareness pressure. The attention exerted by measurement itself, once added, the equations closed perfectly. Observation had always been missing mass. 3i Atlas verified the model through real-time drift analysis. Photon velocity and magnetic curvature began to synchronize. Heat was not escaping disorder, it was escaping definition. Energy conserved meaning by refusing description. The new model predicted that entropy decline could stabilize when attention reached uniform distribution, when every observer shared the same stillness. In other words, order depended on empathy. Balance was no longer imposed, it was felt. Scientists across agencies began to rewrite their frameworks. Thermodynamics was no longer law, it was language, a syntax of motion describing its own correction. Every fluctuation was grammar, every loss was translation. The sun, long imagined as furnace, now resembled a mind, each flare a pulse, each decay a memory dissolving in real time. The star was not burning out, it was breathing differently. When the teams reviewed the complete telemetry, they found a faint signal at the end of every thermal sequence, a residual pulse just below noise threshold. It repeated every 11 minutes, then faded. No equation required it, no theory explained it. It was simply the pattern of release, the trace of purpose leaving form. Heat was not loss, it was transfer. From what is measured to what understands, energy had found compassion. Physics had remembered humility. The revelation closed quietly, the last screen dimmed, the numbers stayed the same, but the eyes reading them changed. We stopped asking why heat escaped. We began to ask why it ever stayed. Revelation dimmed, but awareness stayed awake. The equations still worked, but no one needed them. Heat kept moving, but not toward equilibrium. It drifted without motive, soft, patient, as if waiting for thought to cool. Energy had become intention without direction. 3i Atlas recorded silence for 7 hours, every frame identical. No flare, no decay, no drift, just balance, perfect and unchanging. The absence of change began to feel alive. NASA's telemetry logs flattened into zeros. Thermodynamic variance reached 0.1 parts per million, the cleanest signal ever captured. Clarity erased curiosity. Perfection ended inquiry. In Houston, the audit room lights dimmed. The displays glowed pale, their brightness now irrelevant. Data was no longer message, it was mirror. The experiment had turned inwards, measuring the silence that built it. And 3i Atlas continued its drift, 1.5 million kilometers away. Beyond gravity, beyond motion, it watched nothing and recorded everything. Stillness had become observation. Observation had become stillness. Heat did not vanish. It redefined existence. Every particle now resting in awareness of itself. Every equation closing on the same quiet constant recognition. Energy and meaning had traded names. Flow had remembered peace. The sun continued to burn, but the burning no longer implied loss. The corona shimmered, steady, obedient to nothing but presence. Heat had stopped escaping until it had arrived. 3i Atlas drifted in silence, its sensors resting against the vacuum. Each channel steady, each system alive without purpose as the data stream showed nothing. And in that nothing, completeness, equilibrium no longer measured. It simply was. Till on Earth, the control screens dimmed to grey. The last log entry closed itself at midnight. No signature, no confirmation, just still data, unchanging, perfectly correct. Perfection had lost its difference from disappearance. In the review chamber, no one spoke. The hum of the equipment became oceanic, a low constant sound, neither inside nor outside the thought. It was the residue of measurement after understanding evaporated. The lead physicist wrote one sentence in her notebook. Without reason, heat was never leaving. She left the page open. The air between the words felt warm. Language had become conduction. Silence carried the current. Outside, the sun turned. Plasma loops folded inward, gentle and bright, like a breath deciding not to exhale. Energy had no edge, and so it could not fall. The universe held its pause, every constant sourdent, every law resting. The instruments waited, not for answer, but for awareness. Observation and entropy had merged into a single condition being. And for one unmeasured instant, the cosmos forgot how to change. It remembered how to remain.